Hey everyone, Tom here from NovaCode. So today we are going to cover the second part in our TypeScript tutorial series, and you can find that if you go over to the NovaCodeLLC.com website, and you'll already notice that I have part 3 posted up as well on how to build out our API from scratch. So in this video, we're actually going to cover setting up our Mongo database and Mongoose. When you wrap up, feel free to go over and start part 3 if you want. We don't have a video for it just yet. That's okay. It's coming soon. I'm a little behind on these videos right now, and it's mainly because I've had some freelance work that's sort of tied up a little bit of my schedule, and I haven't been able to kind of get to these things as much as I should have. So I apologize for that, and I thank all of you for being so patient. Let's go ahead and click on the article. And let's see what we need for this particular portion of our tutorial series. So in this video, we are going to need a copy of NPM. We're going to need some Node. We're going to need a Mongo database. We're going to need an IDE. In our case, we'll be using WebStorm. You're going to need Compass, and you're also going to need the first part of this tutorial series, which is called a Node Express server using TypeScript. You can find it on our website, and it's this article right here with the blue TypeScript Node.js icon to it. You can go ahead, follow along. There is a video that is associated with that article, and you can get everything all set up. But I'm not going to cover that. If you're looking to fast lane this and just kind of pick right up with the crowd, you can go over to github.com/NovaCode LLC. And you can go to repos, and you can go to TypeScript Express API. When you're in here, you can stay on the master branch, and you can just clone this project. Once you've pulled that down, you'll be ready to rock and roll. Pick right up with the video. If you've already built this stuff, that's cool. There is a couple of small changes that we have to make because I did notice that there was a few mistakes that I made in the first video. Nothing too major. It's just like the location where like the server TS file is, and there's 2 lines of code that you're going to need to adjust. Very, very minor tweak. So if you already have the original code, I will show you where to make those changes whenever we hit our code base. Next, let's go ahead and begin pulling down Mongo database. So you're going to go to mongodb.org. You're going to go to download. Then you will go to the community server tab, pick your operating system, pick your version, download the MSI, and make sure that you follow along with the instructions. After you're done with installing, do not exit the website. You're going to need one more download. Cool. I'm assuming that you probably put a Mongo database onto your PC by now. Click the the magnifying glass in the toolbar up here. Type in the word compass, search it, and what you're going to look for is this entry right here, MongoDB compass pipe MongoDB. Click on this, and you will be able to find a link somewhere on this page. I'm not going to go searching for it, but there is a, let's probably try it now, huh? Probably, yep, there you go. Yeah, it's been one of those days. I need more coffee. So you can pull down your platform. We'll pull Windows 64-bit, and we'll pull the stable edition. You can download this. Once you have this installed on your PC, go ahead and join back up with us in the video. Great. I'm assuming that you have Compass now installed on your PC, and you're ready to rock and roll. So I'm going to flip over to the article here, and I'm going to slide this on over, and oh, look at that, I already have our IDE loaded up. Make sure that you pull open your TypeScript Express project. If you're new to the WebStorm IDE, you can just do that through open. If this is the first time you've ever opened a project, then you should be on a totally different screen, and the only options you really will have is to either clone something or just open it. If you've been working with this IDE, you can just go to Open Recent, and you can still get a hold of it. Once you have the project opened, there's just a couple of things. So for the viewers who followed along with our first video, There's a couple of small changes you need to make, so make sure that your server TS file is in your SRC folder. And then the next thing that you're going to want to do is go into your bin folder, open up your www file, and make sure that your line 9 here, where we declare our variable of server, and we set it to require, it'll say /server. Just add an extra /server to this, and this should fix a lot of the problems that you're going to wind up having later on with compiling. And you're probably going to go, what in God's name is the issue here? And really what it is that if we pull open the dist folder, and I've already compiled this once, what you'll find is that, one, the server.js file would be missing, and the second thing is that once you finally did figure out that problem and you added it back, what you wouldn't be able to figure out is that the bin folder, whenever the www loads up, it's actually going to step up a directory, but it's going to head down into the server folder, and then it's actually not going to load the server.js file. So by making these changes, we fix those two mistakes. Sorry about that for the people who have already cloned the repo. Let's go ahead and get to writing some code. So you're going to want to skip down to line 96 here. Line 96 on our server TS file is where we're going to declare the database location. So this should be set to default at MongoDB //localhost port 27017, and this is going to be Typescript Express API. You can name your project anything you want, so when we create the database, feel free to go ahead and change that name, but this is where you would do it, is this line 96. The next part that we're going to do is we're going to create a file called dbstartup.bat, and I usually create this at the project level, just new file, and then, dbstartup.bat. I already have this file. I don't need to do it, but go ahead and get that added, and when you do, you're going to want to add a little bit of code here. So you're going to find that every time you go to develop something on your local PC, you're going to have to spin up a local dev copy. Now, if you're in an organization or something, you probably have environmental configurations that you're going to want to set for this stuff. And your server, you won't need to spin it up because it'll just be running somewhere always. But since I do a lot of local development, I just turn on and off my database whenever I need it. That way I'm just not mindlessly running it in the background and consuming PC resources. So here I just have a line called echo. I point this to my MongoDB installation, so I keep it in a development folder on my E drive underneath an applications folder, and this is where all of my important development apps live. And here you'll find the Mongo directory that was installed by the Mongo installer. You're going to go into the bin directory, and then you're going to load up the mongod.exe file. If you're running Mac, you're going to have to write a shell script for this. I'm not very familiar with shell, so if you have the commands for this, please put them in the comments below. I'll add them to the description for this video for our Mac users, and of course I will give you proper citation and credit for your work, and I really appreciate anybody who does that. The next part that we're going to do to this file is we're going to add a DB path flag. So I hope you remember when you installed your database. It should go to some kind of default location, but you probably had to select that. It's most likely on your C drive somewhere, probably under your data folder if you just went with straight up defaults and you didn't set this manually. For me, I changed this, so this is underneath my applications, and I have a data folder here, and I just left it as a default name of DB. Make sure that you set up your pathway to wherever your database file is, because this is where all your data is actually stored. Once you have all of this done, go down to your terminal window, type dbstartup.bat. This will fire up a copy of our database. Next, we are going to jump over to Compass, and I'm already hooked up to the database, but I'll go ahead and disconnect just so I can show you how to get into it. Your version of Compass, now that you just fired it up, will have a host name set to default localhost, port 27017, no authentication. Pretty much you can leave everything at these default settings. So just go ahead and take a look at my screen. If everything you have matches, you should be good to go. I'm going to go ahead and click connect, and I already have this Typescript Express API. Let's just drop the database real fast, and we'll create a new one from scratch for you guys. So this little green button up here, create database, let's go ahead and click that, and we'll do Typescript Express API, and let's do a collection of users. You're going to click Create Database. We now see the new database has been made, and we see users in here. Great. This is pretty much everything that we need to cover for now. And let's scroll down a little bit, and let's go into the server TS file. There's a small bit of code that you're going to need to add. I've already added it here. You can just copy and paste this from step 4 in our guide. And once you have that, join back up with us in the video, and I'll explain this code. So we're going to make a variable declaration for a type of express router. So this is just the syntactical sugar that Express brings to the table. It makes defining routers really easy, and adding them to our server super simple. So we make this type as Express router because what we're going to do in the next line is we're actually going to call the Express router method, which will pass back our router instance. And once we have that instance stored to router, we are going to want to add cores to it, because if you remember from the first video, we talked about cores having requests come in from different port numbers and things along these lines, and that basically our front ends would reject our server responses because they wouldn't have cores headers, and they would look at it as like, pretty much untrusted data. So by adding these cores headers, we now have the ability to talk across servers on different port numbers and not run into all kinds of crazy weird cores errors that you would see blowing up in your console. So all we do here is we just say cores, and we call it as a function, and we set this as router.use, and we pass in this cores function to our router. This now sets it up so that all of our cores headers will automatically be added to our responses from our server, and people can use our API pretty readily. Like I said, there's some tweaks that you can do if you want to secure off which domains are allowed to talk to your API. Since this is just a public API that we're going to create, I really don't need to do anything special. We're just setting it up so that anybody can talk to this API. Next, we call our server, which I named app, and we call the .use method, and we add our router to the server. It's really pretty. It's super simple. We now have exposed our API for all to use on our server. Our server is now aware of this API, and anything that we're going to define here later will get added to our server, and we will know about these endpoints. And I'll show you how to do that in part 3 of this series. So whenever you wrap up, feel free to go ahead and take a look at that tutorial, and it will show you how to begin populating this section in order to add routes to our server. So next, if you are a relational person and you're interested in using NoSQL, this is probably the section you need to work with. You're already used to creating relationships inside of tables, and you're trying to normalize your data. And with NoSQL, we actually go for data denormalization, and we make a lot of duplications of data in all kinds of places. And we do this for querying purposes because we don't have the luxury of being able to do joins like we can inside of a relational database. And later on, you're going to see me do some stuff with Mongoose. It's going to make it look like I'm doing joins, but really the long and the short of it winds up coming down to the fact that for each one of those things that looks like a join inside of Mongoose, it's actually a separate database call. So if you start nesting structures like 5 levels deep, and you got 100,000 connections on a really high volume server, you're talking about 500,000 calls that you're being made if they're all making that same request at the same time. It's a really ridiculous number of calls, and you really don't want to create heavy associations. You want to go very shallow with your data structures, and you want to have a lot of data duplication where needed in order to avoid certain issues where you would have like a lot of ping to your server. If you do everything right, and notice the long pause there, if you do everything right, you'll realize later on that you only really want to define collections for things that can kind of stand on their own and really should be like their own data structure altogether, just because it's a large, immense amount of data, and it really doesn't make sense to try to nest this thing inside of some other data structure, because we're just going to start making our data structures very unwieldy. So you'll get the hang of it as you go, but if you're already familiar with NoSQL, you already know what I'm talking about. So you'll see me do a little data nesting in this portion of the series, and then later on as we move along, we begin adding new information. You're going to see me doing some stuff where, like, I'm not making these object references. I'm actually just dumping this stuff like right into a document and just adding like a new portion to our documents. Okay, so that covers some basics about NoSQL, and it covers some information about our relational databases. So let's model up some data. So let's see. Most of you guys will probably have some users that you're going to have logging into your applications, and they're going to be accessing some data that's only specific to that user. This kind of scheme is pretty standard for the average web app, especially if you're doing something where it's like social media, or you have like some kind of service that you're granting to your users. So I'm going to go with this kind of setup because this is going to be really common, and this is going to make some really nice reusable code for all you folks. So what do we need? We're going to need an email, we're going to need a first name, and we're going to need a password on our user. So that seems pretty good. And let's talk about what do we want to model against that. So when our users log in, we want to give them access to something. So let's just say that we're going to do maybe like a CRM or something like that. Let's do, say, customers. So a customer has a first name, a last name, an email, and a phone. Usually there's some data of interest that goes along with that, but let's just start with the basics. So that's what we're going to model up. And let's go ahead and start by adding some interfaces. So you'll notice I've already added the Typescript files, and I created a customer interface and a user interface. So go ahead and make those files, pause the video if you need to, and then join back up with us. So let's start in the customer interface. So I'm going to paste some code in here, and we're going to export an interface, and we're just going to call this customer interface. This has the first and the last name on it, as well as an email and a phone. You're going to notice that I'm using these little question marks, and if you're not familiar with TypeScript, what this means is that these are optional fields. Each one has a data type of a string, and this pretty much defines our interface that we're going to use. Let's go ahead and add one more field to this, and let's just do created underscore at, and then let's call this a string. And we're going to make this optional. And one of the things that I do want to point out is that when you do your optionals, you always add your optionals last. Because if I was to try to like move this thing up in the order and kind of mix it in, what happens is it's going to cause TypeScript's compiler to blow up, and it's going to tell you that there's something weird about optional arguments, and basically they have to come later in the chain. Next, let's go ahead and hop over to the user interface, and let's go ahead and paste the same our code in. And we're going to have our email, password, and first name. We're also going to have a created at field. This is going to be optional. We're going to make this a string. And notice that you can do this using either commas or semicolons. It's kind of up to you. I do it both ways, depending. Sometimes I use commas, sometimes I use semicolons. Really doesn't matter. Just try to stay consistent with whatever you're using. That way people don't get confused. Next, we will add another optional field. We're going to call this customers. And let's go ahead and make this a type of array. And we're going to make this a really special type. So I'm going to scroll down and cheat a little bit here because I could never remember how to get to the object IDs. But this type is going to be an object ID, and we're going to pull in the schema object. And what this does is that we're going to create object IDs, and this is going to be important later, and I'm going to show you why object IDs are so important in a little bit. But basically, these are index fields, and if you're not familiar with NoSQL, it's kind of like the equivalence of giving NoSQL a GPS coordinate for where your documents are at, and it makes querying much more efficient. I'll show you how that works in a second here once we're done defining these not these schemas, these interfaces. I think that's everything. So you know what? Actually, let's just go ahead and show what I'm talking about. So I have this Pulsar database, and this is pretty much an early version of a database that I had made, and we're kind of modeling this whole entire tutorial series based on this database, by the way. So here I have this customers array, and I have these object IDs in them. And you're going to notice that I have this association here that I've drawn, and I basically just want to say that, you know, I realize I could probably stuff every customer underneath each individual user if I wanted to, but I wanted to kind of keep this neat because in case I ever wanted to maybe make another application and kind of build it into this portion of my database, I could set up other collections and stuff like that and just keep adding things here without this data structure getting all crazy on me. So that was kind of the idea behind this and the reason why I separated this. But we'll take a look at, I think it's this user here, or sorry, this customer here that's going to be important. So whenever I go in, I'm going to go ahead and first let's talk about why I have this object ID thing. And you're going to notice that I call this method object ID and I pass it some string. IDs inside of Mongo are their own objects, and it's kind of funky that you have to think like that. It took me a little while to actually kind of like really wrap my head around it. The first time I ever tried to query an ID inside of Mongo, like I couldn't figure out why I couldn't get the ID, and it drove me crazy. But here, you see, this is how we pull back from our list which customer it is that we're looking at, and this one's customer with test, etc., etc. So I'm going to go to this tab here called Explain Plan, and if you're not familiar with what this is a really important tab because it kind of shows you the efficiencies of your queries. So let's say that I had you know, something like first name. Is this all? Okay, that's all one word. And let's say that I want to look up the value Tom. If I go to Explain Plan, it says that it found the document for Tom, and it returned one document, but it examined 8 documents. And even though we don't really have a huge collection here, so there was no real crazy execution time that was involved. But if I had like a million records, this would take a while because I have to comb through a million records to find this one record. But if I have an indexed field, and it turns out that all object IDs are already an index field. So let's go ahead and pull open this guy again. Let's go to my plan, and let's do an ID field. Let's check object ID, paste in our code, and let's go like this. So now, remember how I said that using an index field is basically like giving a GPS coordinate and saying this thing lives somewhere? Well, what I've done is I've said search all of my documents except for, oh, by the way, I don't need to search all of my documents. I only had to look for one document because I knew the exact address of that document. And that was because I had an index field. So if I index some other field, like say first names or something like that, I can drastically reduce the amount of querying that I have to do because I'm more or less saying that, you know, I know where these documents exist, and it makes it really efficient for me to pull back my data. So this is the difference between like driving down the street and having to read each individual house number and me knowing exactly what house I need to go to. So that's pretty much indexing in a nutshell, and a really, you know, elementary school level explanation of it for people who just kind of want the quick and dirty. Next, let's go ahead and define a schema. So let's go ahead and paste some code here. So I'm going to start with my user schema. Let's drop that code in. So what does all of this mean? That's always the magic question, right? What does it all mean? So we're going to pull in an object called schema, and we're going to do this from the Mongoose library, and we're going to export a variable called user schema, and this data type is going to be a schema object, and we're going to instantiate a schema object here. And its constructor takes a JSON object with some arguments inside of it, and what we do is we declare more or less our document setup. So if I was to go back over here real fast, I was to take a look at these documents. We have our email, our password. I would have a first name and a created at with the schema we use, but we have this customers array. And if I was to take a look here, I can see that I have a string and I have another string and I have an array, and the array has, let's expand this array, object IDs inside of it. So really all I've done is I've taken this pattern and I've already defined like what the structure of every document underneath this collection is going to look like. And that's really all we're doing right here, is we're just defining what that structure is going to be for each individual doc. So now I say, here's my email field, here's my password, my customers, my first name, my created at, and now I'm assigning my data types. So, our string, our object ID, so that's how we get those Mongoose object IDs is that schema types object ID. See, I told you I'd show you where we're getting that. But what's kind of interesting and a little different is that part of the arguments is I'm creating this reference argument, and I'm passing in something called customer. Do I call this thing customer or customers? Let's change this to customers. We'll make that plural. So really what this does is it says that I'm going to have some collection out there called customers, and that these object IDs refer to items in this collection. Next, we have this attribute here, which is required. So I can say which items are required and which ones aren't. So, I didn't define anything for customers. I can just easily go ahead and say, require with the D, it's required. And I can set this to false. I don't think I need to do that in this case. Oh, yeah. I'm just in the wrong spot. That's probably why it looks like I don't need to do that. Let's go ahead and put that there. There we go. So now we have the, required is set to false. Also note that I got this default argument. This default argument says that there's going to be some default value that I'm going to assign. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually timestamping. I call date.now. And I say run the date.now function, get me a timestamp, and then load whatever date.now is as the default value for anything that's created. So this is awesome because now I have a way of timestamping every time my users show up. So if I have like a subscription-based model or something like that, I can evaluate whether or not it's time for this user to renew an annual subscription, for example. Let's go ahead and define a customer schema. So we won't need to explain this because I'll just let you take a look at this code. This should all now be easy for you to follow and very understandable. I do want to note, though, that whenever you define an array inside of your schema, you use the square brackets to define that this value is an array. Easy enough, right? Easy peasy. And all we're doing on the inside is we're saying this array is filled with some stuff. I'm actually going to remove false here because these are technically, well, no, I guess we can leave it. We can leave it. Yeah, don't worry about it. We'll just leave it. Cool. So we have schemas defined. We have interfaces defined. So, we kind of got these two things. They sort of mirror each other. So why did we do this? And this is where it all kind of comes together. Cool. So we have put in a little bit of code here. We've pasted some stuff in. And add the plural here. I think this is customer schema. So just got to drop the S. There. That looks better. Apparently, whenever I wrote the code and I did the video, I added plurals in some places I didn't. So, it's kind of up to you, but I just fixed it in the code base. So I don't think you should have too much of a problem following because red lines are helpful, right? So what's going on here? Well, there's a lot of code that's packed into these three small lines, and it's going to make a little bit of sense here in a second once I explain it. So we're going to call in Mongoose because we're going to need the Mongoose library in order to create a representation of what a collection and a document in said collection looks like. We're going to pull in two interfaces from the Mongoose library, and we're going to pull in model and document. And then we're going to pull in our schema in our interface. Now I want you to notice that I have as iCustomer. And this is really something I just kind of wanted to show you. It's not necessary for this project. You could totally delete it if you wanted to. But what happens if I was kind of sloppy and I named my interface customer? So we'll just say this was an interface. And now I'm defining this file. And in the process of me defining this file, what happens when I come down here and I got to export a constant called customer. Well, I'm going to have like a weird name collision now because, this thing's going to be like, well, oh, you've already used an interface called customer. Why are you assigning customer? Don't do that. By declaring it as iCustomer, we're actually setting aside a different namespace for this interface so that when we refer to it, we have clarity between whether or not I'm talking about the interface or I'm talking about this export. Since I have a really unique name called customer interface, I've already made that distinction for you already. And you actually don't need this as iCustomer. You can totally remove that if you want. But I'm going to leave it here in case you ever run into this kind of naming collision. That way you have it as a reference. So now we have this export interface, and we're going to call this customer model. And it's going to extend the iCustomer interface, which, if you remember, our customer interface was just all of the attributes that were associated with this object. And then we're also going to extend Mongoose's document interface. So if I control click this, I'm going to head on in. And they weren't really good about leaving a crazy doc here that really describes this interface and what it's doing. But what it does is it does extend the Mongoose document object. And this gives us a lot of information about what Mongoose documents are allowed to do. So by extending this interface, we have made it so that we're allowed to remove documents, we can save documents when we instantiate them, because instances will be this Mongoose document type, and now we have access to all the fun stuff on them. So, we can check and see if a record's been deleted, but really the two most common ones you will work with is saving the document and removing a document. Next, we're going to pull in the model. So you're going to notice I got a red line here, and that's because we actually need to do customer model and set that up. So now that we've pulled in the typing as a customer model, let's go ahead and take a look at what the model interface actually is. Head over to Mongoose here, and Mongoose says that provides an interface to MongoDB collections as well as creates document instances. So if you remember beforehand, we had a interface that we said, hey, there's all these attributes on it, plus there's these methods that are available. And now we're creating a static model version, and this static model is saying that, by the way, this thing defines all the values that are on a collection. So we know what type is underneath that collection, and now we know what a collection should look like and what methods are available on that collection. So we can do things like have bulk rights, we can do find by ID, we can do where clauses, aggregation functions, we can create new documents, we could do distinct and check for whether or not a document is distinct, find by ID and remove. There's all kinds of fun stuff in here. There's pretty much, if you can find it in the MongoDB documentation, there's probably a function that's associated with it. So now we are going to create a Mongoose model, and we are going to say that instances that are created from this customer item will follow the customer model. So now we have that whole thing where I know what attributes are on those documents, and I know what functions are available on those documents. And we are also going to say that this customer this customer variable itself follows the static model. So this is essentially like saying that this is the customer collection. Let's throw an S at the end of this. And now we know what different functions are available on that collection. Next, we're going to say that this corresponds to the customer's collection itself, and this gives it the naming, and we are going to now say that all documents follow this schema or pattern. And this is going to be used for validations and things later on whenever we're doing saves. It'll tell us whether or not Mongo will even accept information that we've passed in on these objects when we attempt to save and make updates and things along those lines. Whew, that was a lot of information inside of a really small amount of code. So let's go ahead and do the same thing now for our user. And that'll pretty much sum up this video. So we're going to head over to the user schema, or not schema, user model, paste this code in. We are going to make a couple of little changes to fix some of these errors here. So we have user interface from interfaces, and we need to call this user interface. And then we have a schema here. We have user schemas. And we need to drop this S, and that fixes that. And then for our model, we need to pull in the user model to define our documents. And that's everything. Good to go. And I'll make these updates on the site so that when you copy and paste, you don't have to make all these changes to the code. So that pretty much wraps everything up in this video. And I think that you're going to want to get to building your API. So if you got a little bit of time, head on over to part 3 in our tutorial series. And we're going to show you how to begin putting routes up on your API and begin hitting those endpoints from your web browser, from Postman, and begin working with those items and being able to consume those endpoints. So if you like this video, remember to like and subscribe to the channel below. And if you have any projects that you'd like us to work on, please feel free to get a hold of us. Head on over to www.novacodellc.com, and up in the upper right hand corner there's a Hire Us button. Click on that, fill out the forms, and we'll get an email and get a rep that's connected with you here very shortly. And as always, I really appreciate you taking the time to watch our video, and if you have any kinds of feedback you'd like to leave, put it in the comment section below. I will take a look at that information, and if there's any subjects you want to cover, make sure that you put that information down there, because I'd really like to build videos that you guys want to watch. So with that, until next time, I will see you all very soon.